Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today I with my group members will be discussing on the topic the Green Revolution and land reforms of Pakistan of 1959 and 72. Before the peak of Green Revolution, the annual growth rate in agriculture between 1949 and 58 was a mere 1.43%, which was less than half of the annual growth rate in population. Agriculture was allowed to stagnate in the 1950s because the ruling elite believed at that time that it was essential to industrialize at all costs and at great speed. Government policies were heavily biased against agriculture, and it was only towards the end of the 1950s when it became clear that growth in agriculture was necessary for the survival of the country that the importance of the agriculture sector was recognized. If you look at the figures, it shows the growth rates in agriculture in the 1950s and 1960s and indicates a marked change between the two decades. Between 1959 and 1964, agriculture grew at an overall rate of 3.7%, but this impressive rate was overshadowed by the even greater 6.3% rate between 1965 and 1970. Between 1966 to 1968, the years when the Green Revolution was at its peak, agriculture output grew by 11.7%, and it maintained a high growth rate of 9.6% in 1968 to 9 and 1969 to 70. The phenomenal increase in growth took place in two phases. In the first, 1960 to 1965, the main cause of the growth was the increase in agriculture facilities, mainly tube wells. The second phase was between 1965 to 6 and 1969 to 70 showed impressive growth when the expanded irrigation facilities were supplemented by the technology package of high-yielding variety seeds, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides. Essentially, then it was the complete package of water, seed fertilizer, and pesticides that caused the large growth in agriculture output and production. Furthermore, talking about the factors that contributed to the Green Revolution, tube wells was one of that. While the growth in tube wells from a few hundred in 1960 to 75,000 in 1968 and 1,56,000 in 1975 was a key factor in providing irrigation and hence in permitting the adoption of the technology package, there are a number of issues around the apparently simple and supposedly mere technical issue of sinking tube wells. The first issue concerns the location of tube wells. They were highly concentrated regionally, mainly in the rich old settled districts and the canal colony districts of Punjab. Secondly, given their size and cost, tube wells were mainly installed by landowners with over 25 acres of land. Thirdly, inducement to investment in tube wells was given to farmers through large public subsidies on fuel, installation cost, and maintenance. Secondly, tractorization was also an integral part of the Green Revolution. Tractors are now an important part of the agriculture and rural scene, but their contribution during the Green Revolution had very important consequences. In 1959, there were 2,000 tractors in the country, which increased by over 8,000% to 18,909 in 1968. Due to these factors of tractorization tubers, there was an increased amount of regional and income disparities. Most of these activities were carried out by those people who had adequate resources. If you look at the statistics, it can be seen that Punjab had the most agriculture superiority, and we can say that the Green Revolution hence was led by Punjab. Furthermore, the rapid agriculture growth was led by dynamic middle class farmers who were considered an important factor in the political system. The increasing leasing of land enabled landowners to self cultivate.
The social and political effects saw the displacement of labor in the agricultural field, and there was a change of attitude towards education due to the mechanization and increased use of chemical pesticides. And there was a change in the size efficiency relationship due to the use of tractors and tube wells and different technologies that were considered new at the time, and due to the promises that the Pakistan People's Party made to the farmers and landowners, there was an overwhelming electoral victory in their favor. And due to mechanization, the most important thing was the decreased means of livelihood that were seen in that time.
Now we will talk about land reforms. Pakistan has had a long and varied history of land reforms. Most attempts have been just that, attempts without any serious purpose. The following chart gives details of many such attempts, most of which failed. From 1945 onwards, there was talk of reform in the nature of tenancy and in the structure of landholding, but little came of it. Furthermore, the reasons for this are fairly clear and not surprising. In the Central Council of the Muslim League in 1947, there was a large representation from the large landlords of the provinces of the Punjab and Sindh. They comprised 50% of the councilmen from Punjab and 60% from Sindh. Furthermore, with quite exploitative conditions in rural areas in the 1940s involving complete domination and control by landlords, it was a little idealistic to assume that they themselves would be willing to put a dent in their source of power. Moving further, the first land reforms in Pakistan were undertaken by a military regime that was perceived to be modern and progressive. The Ayub Khan regime did not owe its allegiance to, and nor was it dependent on, the influence of the agrarian landed class, and thus it was in a position to undertake some sort of reform. However, all the reforms set out to break the power of the large land-holding class and to make tenancy more humane. Their impact was severely limited. What they did was to distribute power away from some landlords and include the civil and military elite in this strategy. While Shah Javed Bukhari has implied that these land reforms are the precursor to the dynamic middle class farmer of the Green Revolution, who emerged as the main beneficiary of the basic democracy system, scholars argued that the basic democracy system maintained the hold of the landlord on the political system of Pakistan, whereas some argued that the 1959 land reforms were an eyewash, where the power of the ruling coalition of landowners, bureaucrats, and industrialists was left well intact.
So now we will discuss the 1959 land reforms which were introduced by Ayub Khan. Previously, land ownership was highly skewed as a few large landlords owned major portion of the land. There were approximately 6,000 landowners who owned more than the ceiling of 500 acres permitted in 1959 land reforms. This shows that 0.1% owners owned 7.5 million acres of land. Although the 1959 land reforms were introduced, implementation was a difficult process because the main portion of the land was retained by the landlords as they could transfer it to their dependents and other family members. Even after the implementation of the 1959 land reforms, only a small amount of land was handed over which could not be cultivated as most of the parts were hills or deserts, so it was not even fit for cultivation. Due to the compensation promised by the government, many landlords decided to hand over poor quality lands to the government and receive huge sums of compensation in return. The compensation was paid to the landlords at the rate of 1 to 5 per produce index unit and 50 half-yearly installments in bonds.
The 1959 reforms also included the feature that resumed land should be sold to the landless tenants. But by 1967, only 20% of the 50% sold resumed land was bought by landless tenants. The remaining 30% was auctioned to rich farmers and civil and military officials. Jagirs were also abolished in 1959 to transform them into revenue-paying tracts. 3 million acres were resumed by the government in 1960. These land reforms enabled farmers to have their land valued in PIUs, which is a measure of land productivity. But this measurement of PIUs was based on pre-partition revenue settlements, which led to the true value of land go underreported. Moreover, each farmer could have maximum of 3,600 PIUs, which was far greater than the allotted ceiling of 500 acres of irrigated land. In short, these reforms could not reduce the feudal power of landlords.
So now we will discuss the 1972 land reforms. An individual cannot hold land in excess of 150 acres of irrigated land and 300 acres of unirrigated land or a combination of both. The transfer of land in any manner made by anyone possessing the land in excess of ceiling was declared invalid. The tenancy reforms stated that the tenant removal was strictly prohibited unless it is established by a revenue court that the tenant has filed or if the tenant has failed to pay the rent in accordance to the term of his tenancy. Now talking about the utilization of resumed area, any area in excess of prescribed ceiling was to be resumed or to be revested in the government. A tenant who was shown into the revenue record to be cultivating the resumed area during the entire of the crop season was given the first priority during land allocation and the land would be distributed accordingly.
We hope you liked our video. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.